Marcus Chen stood in the rain outside the underground auction house, his leather shoes sinking into the grimy puddles of a forgotten alley in downtown Portland. He had built an empire by the age of 32, turning a single tech startup into a billion-dollar corporation that revolutionized artificial intelligence, but nothing in his world of boardrooms and luxury penthouses had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The text message on his phone had been anonymous, cryptic, and disturbing enough to pull him away from a crucial investor meeting: children being sold tonight. Warehouse on 5th and Morrison. If you have any humanity left, come now. Marcus had almost deleted it, convinced it was some kind of sick prank, but something in those words wouldn't let him look away. Perhaps it was the ghost of his own past, the memory of being powerless and small. Or perhaps it was the photograph attached to the message showing two small faces pressed against a chain-link fence, their eyes hollow with a terror no child should ever know. The door to the warehouse was rusted and heavy, and when Marcus pushed it open, the scene inside made his blood run cold. Dim yellow lights cast shadows across a crowd of about 30 people, most of them wealthy-looking men and women who stood around with the casual indifference of people shopping for furniture. At the front of the room, on a raised platform that looked like it had been hastily constructed from wooden pallets, stood a woman in her 40s with bleached blonde hair and a cigarette dangling from her lips. She was presenting two children, twin girls who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, their matching faces streaked with dirt and tears, their small bodies trembling in thin, torn dresses that hung off their fragile frames like rags. If this story reminds you why we must never stop fighting for the innocent, please like this video. Leave a comment about what kindness means to you, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances, and subscribe to this channel. Sometimes one story can change how we see the world. Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest as he stared at those two little girls. The woman, who introduced herself as Rita, was their stepmother, and she spoke about them with the cold detachment of someone selling livestock. She explained that their father had died 6 months ago, that she couldn't afford to care for them anymore, that they were healthy and obedient and could be useful for whoever wanted them. The words were vile, but what struck Marcus most was the expression on the twins' faces. They weren't crying anymore. They had moved past tears into that terrible place of resigned hopelessness that happens when a child stops believing that anyone will save them. The girl on the left had dark tangled hair that fell past her shoulders, and she held her sister's hand so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The girl on the right had the same dark hair but with a small scar above her eyebrow, and she stood slightly in front of her sister, as if even in this nightmare she was trying to protect her. The bidding started at $5,000, and Marcus felt bile rise in his throat as hands went up around the room. These people, these monsters dressed in expensive clothes, were actually participating in this horror. He didn't think. He didn't calculate or strategize the way he normally would in business. He simply raised his hand and said in a voice that cut through the warehouse like a knife, $1 million for both of them. Cash. Right now. The room went silent. Rita's eyes went wide with greed, and she began nodding enthusiastically, but Marcus had already pulled out his phone and was making a call to his attorney. Within 20 minutes, a team of lawyers arrived with briefcases full of money and legal documents that essentially transferred custody of the two girls to Marcus through an emergency private arrangement that skirted the edges of legality but was ironclad enough to keep Rita from ever coming near them again. Marcus carried the twins out of that warehouse himself, one in each arm, and they weighed almost nothing, their bodies limp with exhaustion and shock. He took them directly to the hospital, where doctors examined them and confirmed what Marcus had feared. They were severely malnourished, covered in bruises in various stages of healing, and suffering from untreated infections and emotional trauma that would take years to process. As the nurses cleaned them up and started IV fluids, Marcus sat in the waiting room with his head in his hands, trying to understand what he had just done. He had no experience with children. His life was conferences and code and endless work. He had never even considered having a family because he had convinced himself that his own childhood had damaged him too much to be a good father. But looking at those two small faces through the window of the hospital room, something ancient and primal woke up inside him, a fierce protective instinct that had nothing to do with logic. The twins stayed in the hospital for 3 days, and Marcus never left. He canceled every meeting, ignored every email, and spent his time reading to them from books the nurses brought and simply being present in a way no one had ever been present for him when he was young. Slowly, they began to speak. The girl with the scar was named Emma, and her sister was Lily. They had turned 7 2 months ago, but no one had celebrated. Their father had been a kind man, a construction worker who loved them desperately, but he had died in an accident at a job site, and their stepmother Rita had immediately shown her true nature. She had locked them in a basement, fed them scraps, and eventually decided they were worth more sold than kept. The girls spoke in quiet, broken sentences, and every word felt like a knife in Marcus's heart. On the 4th day, as Marcus was filling out paperwork to begin the formal adoption process, a social worker named Jennifer came to the hospital room with a manila folder in her hands and an expression of complete disbelief on her face. She asked Marcus to step into the hallway, and when they were alone, she opened the folder and showed him a photograph. It was a picture from 7 years ago, taken in a different hospital across town, showing a young couple holding newborn twin girls. The mother in the photograph had died during childbirth, and the father had been so devastated that he had left the hospital that same night with the babies, refusing all follow-up care and disappearing into the city. The hospital had filed reports, but the case had eventually gone cold. Jennifer's hands were shaking as she pointed to the father in the photograph, and Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The man in the picture was younger, healthier, but unmistakably Marcus himself. He stared at the photograph as memories came flooding back, memories he had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself they were dreams. 7 years ago, before the success, before the billions, Marcus had been a different person. He had been desperately in love with a woman named Sarah, and when she got pregnant with twins, he had been terrified but ready to try. But Sarah's pregnancy had complications, and when she died on the delivery table, something inside Marcus had shattered completely. He remembered holding the babies, remembered the overwhelming terror of being alone with 2 lives depending on him when he could barely keep himself together. He remembered the panic attack that sent him running from the hospital, telling himself he would come back, that he just needed air, just needed a moment. But that moment had turned into an hour, then a day, then a week, and by the time he finally returned to the hospital, child services had taken the babies and the whole situation had become a legal nightmare he didn't have the resources to fight. Marcus had convinced himself that the twins would be better off adopted by a real family, people who knew what they were doing, and he had thrown himself into his work with manic intensity, building his company as a way to outrun the guilt and shame. He had checked occasionally over the years, always told they had been adopted by a good family, never knowing that the truth was so much darker. The construction worker who raised them had been their adoptive father, a man named James who had genuinely loved them, but when he died, the system had failed, and Rita, his second wife who had never legally adopted the girls, had slipped through the cracks. Marcus walked back into the hospital room where Emma and Lily were sleeping, their small hands still clasped together even in rest, and he felt tears streaming down his face for the first time in a decade. He sat down between their beds and whispered to them even though they couldn't hear, telling them everything, telling them he was sorry, telling them he had been broken and stupid and that he would spend the rest of his life making it right. When they woke up an hour later, Marcus was still sitting there, and Emma, the brave one with the scar, looked at him with those ancient, knowing eyes and asked why he was crying. Marcus told them the truth. He told them everything, in words simple enough for 7-year-olds to understand. He told them about their mother Sarah, about how beautiful and kind she was. He told them about his mistakes, about how he ran away because he was scared. He told them that he had just found out who they really were, and that if they would give him a chance, he wanted to be their father for real this time. The twins looked at each other in that way twins do, communicating without words, and then Lily, the quieter one, reached out her small hand and placed it on Marcus's arm. She said something so simple and profound that it would stay with Marcus forever. You came back. You bought us when nobody else wanted us. That means you're already our daddy. Emma nodded and added, and daddies don't leave. Marcus pulled them both into his arms and held them while they cried together, 3 broken people beginning the long process of becoming whole. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe in the power of redemption and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel. These stories matter because they remind us that it's never too late to do the right thing. And please, leave a comment below telling us about a time when someone gave you a second chance, or when you gave one to someone else. The road ahead wasn't easy. Marcus hired therapists and tutors and did everything money could buy, but the real healing came from the small moments. Breakfast together every morning, bedtime stories every night, Emma learning to laugh again, Lily discovering that she loved to paint. Marcus restructured his entire company so he could work from home most days, and his employees watched in amazement as the driven, cold CEO they knew transformed into a man who left meetings early for school plays and kept crayon drawings in his briefcase. 2 years after that night in the warehouse, Marcus stood in a courtroom as a judge finalized the adoption, making official what had already been true in their hearts. Emma and Lily Chen were his daughters, and he was their father, and the missing years didn't matter anymore because they had the rest of their lives to make new memories. On the anniversary of the day he found them, Marcus took the girls back to that warehouse, which had since been shut down and converted into a community center for at-risk youth, funded anonymously by Marcus's foundation. They planted a tree in front of it together, and Emma said it was for all the other kids who were still waiting to be found. Marcus realized then that his daughters, these two small warriors who had survived so much, were teaching him more about strength and forgiveness than he could ever teach them. They had taken his guilt and shame and transformed it into something beautiful, and every day with them was a reminder that sometimes the greatest success has nothing to do with money or power, but with showing up for the people who need you most, even when you don't think you're ready, even when you're afraid. Marcus Chen had bought his daughters for $1 million in a moment of desperate humanity, but the truth was they had saved him, pulling him back from a life of empty achievement into something real and necessary and achingly beautiful. And though the beginning of their story was dark, the life they built together was filled with light, proving that even the most broken things can be made whole again when love refuses to give up.